On a sun-scorched homestead in the Arizona Territory, Sarah Matthews tends to her land with steady hands and a growing belly. 6 months pregnant, she moves with the practiced grace of someone who knows every inch of her property. What she doesn't know is that 5 desperate men are watching from the shadow of the mesa, their prison chains barely filed away, their eyes fixed on what they think is easy prey. They see a woman alone, vulnerable in her condition. What they don't see is the rifle oil beneath her fingernails or the shooting medals hidden in her trunk. They don't know about the years she spent as her father's star pupil, learning the art of the long shot while other girls learned needlework. They can't see the cold calculation in her eyes as she spots their tracks in the dust. They're about to learn that some predators pick the wrong prey. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn broke over the Arizona Territory like a cracked egg, spilling golden light across the dusty plains. Sarah Matthews had been awake long before the sun, her practiced hands moving through the familiar motions of ranch life. Even with her belly swollen to 6 months, she maintained the rhythm that had become as natural as breathing. The morning air carried the scent of sage and morning glory as she worked, checking the chicken coop first, then moving to tend the vegetable garden that would feed her and Thomas through the winter. Her husband's absence weighed on her, but the cattle drive would bring them the money they needed before the baby arrived. Besides, Sarah Matthews had never been one to shy away from handling things on her own. As she worked, her mind drifted back to cooler mornings 15 years ago, when her father would wake her before dawn. While other girls her age were learning to embroider and serve tea, Sarah was learning to read the wind. "The rifle is just an extension of your eye," he'd say, adjusting her grip on the Winchester. "And your eye is just an extension of your will." She'd been 12 when she first hit a target at 400 yards, her father's proud laugh echoing across the valley. The memory brought a smile to her face as she pressed a hand against her growing belly, feeling the flutter of movement within. "Your grandfather would have loved you something fierce," she whispered, pausing to rest against the fence post. The morning sun caught the silver wedding band on her finger, a simple circle that represented the life she and Thomas had built here over the past 3 years. Their homestead wasn't much to look at. A sturdy 2-room cabin with a root cellar, a barn that needed fresh paint, and 40 acres of land that was more rock than soil. But it was theirs, earned with calloused hands and stubborn determination. Sarah had chosen the spot herself, noting the natural defensive positions, the clear lines of sight, the way the mesa would block the worst of the winter winds. Old habits died hard, her father would have said. Moving to the barn, she checked their remaining supplies. Thomas had left enough feed for the livestock to last until his return, but something felt off. The grain sack seemed lower than it should be, and there was a scuff mark on the floor she didn't recognize. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her lower back, where the familiar weight of her father's colt usually rode. Now it rested in the kitchen drawer. Too uncomfortable to wear with her changing body, a cry from the hawk circling overhead drew her attention. Sarah scanned the horizon, taking in the familiar landscape with new eyes. Something had changed in her territory. The tracks near the water trough weren't from her boots or Thomas's work shoes. The grass behind the barn had been pressed down by bodies sleeping rough. Her father's voice whispered in her memory, "The land speaks to those who know how to listen, girl, and right now it's telling me you've got company coming." Sarah moved back to the house with unhurried steps, her mind already cataloguing the weapons cached around the property. The Winchester above the door, the shotgun behind the root cellar stairs, the rifle oil and cleaning kit in the trunk beside her grandmother's quilt and her shooting medals. A lifetime of preparation wrapped in the disguise of a simple rancher's wife. She wouldn't call herself paranoid, just her father's daughter. The same instincts that had made him the territory's most respected shooting instructor now sang in her blood, warning her that trouble was brewing. As she reached the porch, her hand brushed against the carved marking on the post, 3 notches that meant 300 yards to the mesa. Every distance from the house had been measured, every angle considered. Inside, Sarah put on coffee and began her preparations. The morning passed quietly, but she knew better than to relax. In the territory, trouble always announced itself eventually. And when it did, Sarah Matthews would be ready, pregnant or not. She patted her belly again, feeling the strong kick of her child. "Don't you worry, little one," she murmured, checking the primer on her Winchester. "Your mama's got everything under control." The afternoon heat pressed down like a wool blanket, but Sarah couldn't shake the chill that had settled between her shoulder blades. The signs were becoming clearer with each passing hour. Someone was watching the homestead. She'd found fresh cigarette butts by the creek, tobacco different from Thomas's preferred brand. The worn rope she used for hanging laundry had been expertly retied, but not in her usual knot. At the back of the barn, Sarah crouched carefully, her pregnant belly making the motion awkward. 5 distinct boot prints in the soft earth, all heading west toward the mesa. One set belonged to a man with a slight limp, his right foot dragging just enough to leave a deeper impression. Another showed the distinctive pattern of prison-issued boots, the kind her father had pointed out to her years ago. "Knowledge is a weapon, girl," he'd told her. "Every detail you notice is another round in your arsenal." Now, those lessons were painting a clear picture. Escaped prisoners, probably from the territorial prison in Yuma. The recent newspaper Thomas had brought home before leaving had mentioned a breakout. 5 men, all serving time for violent crimes. Moving with deliberate casualness, Sarah began her preparations. She adjusted the heavy curtains in the house, creating narrow gaps that would allow her to see out while keeping anyone from spotting movement inside. The Winchester was cleaned and loaded, positioned near the kitchen window, with its clear view of the approach to the house. She moved Thomas's old rocking chair to the porch, a seemingly innocent touch that gave her a perfect firing position toward the barn. Her body ached as she worked, the baby's weight making each movement more challenging. But Sarah had learned to adapt, to compensate for her changing center of gravity. The shotgun, too heavy now for comfortable handling, was replaced with her father's lighter Colt carbine. She positioned ammunition caches within easy reach of her usual resting spots, by the stove, near the bedroom window, beside the rocking chair. As the sun began to set, Sarah lit the lamps in her usual pattern, maintaining the appearance of routine. But beneath that facade of normalcy, her mind was mapping out firing lanes and calculating distances. The mesa cast long shadows across the property, and in those deepening patches of darkness, she caught glimpses of movement. Quick, furtive shapes darting between cover. They were getting bolder. Sarah sat in the rocking chair, a shawl draped over her shoulders despite the lingering heat. Her hands worked at some knitting, a blanket for the baby, but her attention never wavered. From the gathering shadows, the warm light spilling from her windows would be blinding to anyone watching from the darkness, creating a perfect backdrop for any would-be intruder to stand out against. A soft clatter from the chicken coop drew her attention. Not the usual settling sounds of the birds. This was the deliberate movement of someone trying to be quiet and not quite managing it. Sarah kept her rocking steady, counting the seconds between each creak of the chair's runners. "Come on then," she whispered to herself, feeling the familiar calm settle over her. It was the same stillness she'd found at shooting competitions, the absolute focus that had made her father beam with pride. "Show me what you're planning." The night deepened, and with it came the certainty that tomorrow would bring violence to her doorstep. These men, whoever they were, had chosen her homestead for a reason. They'd watched, probably seeing Thomas ride out with the cattle drive. Seen only a pregnant woman, alone and vulnerable. The kind of target that desperate men would consider easy prey. Sarah felt the baby shift restlessly, responding to her tension. She rubbed her belly soothingly, humming an old lullaby under her breath. "Your timing could be better, little one," she murmured. "But we'll manage. We always do." She rocked and watched, a deceptively peaceful figure in the lamplight. Let them think her unaware. Let them believe what they wanted about pregnant women and lonely homesteads. Sarah Matthews had been underestimated before, in shooting competitions, in land deals, in every aspect of frontier life that some thought too harsh for a woman. Tomorrow would teach them differently. Tomorrow they would learn that some women were far more dangerous than any man could imagine. They came at mid-morning, when the sun was high enough to cast harsh shadows across the yard. Sarah was hanging laundry, a domestic scene they'd no doubt been waiting for. 3 men emerged from behind the barn, while 2 others circled wide, trying to flank her position. Their attempted subtlety almost made her smile. It was exactly what her father would have called amateur hour tactics. The leader stepped forward, all swagger and false charm. He was tall, with prison-pale skin, and eyes that reminded her of a rattler's, cold and unblinking. The shackle marks on his wrists were still red and raw. "Morning, ma'am," he called out, tipping an imaginary hat. "Hope we're not disturbing your chores." His voice carried the kind of forced politeness that preceded violence. Sarah kept her movements unhurried as she pinned another sheet to the line. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Her tone was mild, but her mind was already counting steps to the nearest weapon. 15 to the porch, 20 to the barn. Matter of fact, you can. The leader moved closer, his boots kicking up dust. "See, my friends and I have been riding hard, getting mighty hungry. Thought maybe a kind Christian woman might spare some food for travelers down on their luck." Sarah noted how the other men were spreading out, trying to surround her. The limping one she'd tracked earlier had a crude knife visible in his belt. Another carried a length of rope, poorly hidden behind his back. "My husband's due back any minute," she said, the practiced lie rolling easily off her tongue. "But suppose I could spare some bread and water." The leader's smile widened, showing teeth filed to points during his prison stay. "Now don't you go worrying about your husband, ma'am. We know he's out with the cattle drive, won't be back for weeks by our reckoning." And there it was, the threat beneath the courtesy, the confirmation that they'd been watching. Sarah felt the baby kick, as if sensing her spike of adrenaline. "Ain't right," the leader continued, taking another step forward. "Leaving a woman in your condition all alone out here. Dangerous country, all sorts of bad men about." A laugh rippled through. His companions, the one with the rope, was circling behind her now, thinking himself clever. Sarah shifted her weight, adjusting her stance the way her father had taught her. "You're right about that," she said softly. "All sorts of bad men. The kind that break, out of humor territorial, and think a pregnant woman makes an easy target." The leader's smile vanished. His hand twitched toward the pistol poorly concealed under his stolen jacket. "Now, ain't no call to be unfriendly, ma'am. We're just asking for some Christian charity, like the charity you showed that family in." "Phoenix?" Sarah kept her voice steady. "The ones you robbed and left tied up in their own barn. That was you boys, wasn't it? The paper said there were 5 of you." The pretense of civility evaporated. The leader's face hardened into the cruel mask she'd expected all along. "Seems to me you know too much for your own good, woman. But don't you worry. We'll give you a choice. You can either be smart and cooperative-like, or you can make things real difficult for yourself and that baby." Sarah looked at each man in turn, memorizing their faces, noting their positions. The sun was at their backs. They'd planned that, thinking to blind her. Instead, it cast their shadows long across the ground, making their every movement easy to track. "I'll give you a choice." "2," she said, her hand resting on her belly. "You can turn around and leave my property right now, or you can find out why my father's students used to call me Dead-Eye Sarah." The leader laughed, but there was an edge of uncertainty in it. "Brave talk from a woman who can barely stand. Straight with that belly. Boys, I think it's time we taught this one some manners. Sarah saw their muscles tense, saw the moment they committed to violence. Time seemed to slow, just like it used to during competitions. Her father's voice whispered in her memory, "Let them make the first move, girl. Let them show you who they really are. Then show them who you are." The man with the rope lunged forward. Sarah Matthews smiled. The man with the rope never saw her draw. One moment he was lunging forward, rope extended. The next he was sprawled in the dust, clutching his shoulder where Sarah's bullet had torn through muscle and sinew. Her father's Colt seemed to materialize. In her hand, the movement so practiced it looked like magic. "That was a warning," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent yard. The gun's barrel shifted smoothly between targets, covering the remaining men with the same precision that had won her dozen of shooting competitions. "The next one won't be." The leader's hand jerked toward his pistol. Sarah's second shot kicked up dirt between his feet, forcing him to stumble backward. "That's 2 warnings," she said. "I'm running out of patience." The wounded man moaned in the dust, his blood darkening the dry earth. His companions stood frozen, their false bravado evaporating in the face of genuine skill. Sarah used their hesitation to back slowly toward the porch, her movements smooth despite her pregnant belly. "You crazy bitch," the leader snarled, but he kept his hands well away from his weapon. "You have any idea what we do to people who shoot at us?" Sarah's laugh was cold as winter water. "You have any idea what I do to men who threaten my child?" The Colt never wavered. "Your friend there is bleeding, but he'll live if he gets help soon. That's more mercy than you showed your last victims." The limping man made a sudden move, pulling his crude knife. Sarah's third shot sent it spinning from his grip, along with 2 of his fingers. His scream echoed off the mesa as he fell, clutching his maimed hand. 3 warnings, Sarah said. "I'm not giving a 4th. The remaining men looked at their leader, uncertainty plain on their faces. They'd come expecting an easy target, a helpless pregnant woman to terrorize. Instead, they'd found themselves outmatched by someone who handled a gun like she'd been born with it in her hand. "You can't watch all of us at once," the leader growled, but his eyes betrayed his fear. "Not in your condition. Not all day and all night." Sarah's smile was reminiscent of her father's, the one he'd worn when teaching students a particularly harsh lesson. "Want to bet your life on that? The territory's best marksmen used to come to my father for training. Who do you think he practiced with at home?" The leader's face twisted with rage and humiliation. His hand twitched toward his gun again, and Sarah saw the decision form in his eyes a split second before he moved. The Colt roared one final time. The leader's pistol flew from his hand, taking most of his trigger finger with it. He howled, dropping to his knees as blood spurted from the wound. "Get him out of here," Sarah commanded the 2 uninjured men. "Take your wounded and go. If I see any of you on my property again, I won't aim for fingers and shoulders." They fled like scolded dogs, half carrying their injured companions. Their curses and threats drifted back on the wind, but Sarah noted how they kept glancing over their shoulders, fear having replaced their earlier arrogance. When they disappeared behind the mesa, Sarah finally allowed herself to shake. The baby was kicking frantically, disturbed by the gunfire and excitement. She holstered the Colt and ran a soothing hand over her belly. "It's all right, little one," she whispered. "They're gone for now." But she knew better than to believe it was over. Men like that, their pride wounded worse than their bodies, would be back. They'd be smarter next time, more cautious. Sarah checked her ammunition and began making preparations. The sun was already past its peak, and darkness would be their ally. She needed to be ready. As she worked, her father's words echoed in her memory. "The most dangerous shot isn't the first one, girl. It's the one they don't see coming." Dusk gathered like spilled ink across the Arizona sky, and Sarah Matthews worked with the efficiency of someone who knew darkness would bring death to her door. She moved through the house, checking sightlines and ammunition stores, her mind drifting back to the last shooting competition she'd entered before marrying Thomas. "You're wasted out here," Jenkins, the territorial marshal, had said after she'd outshot every lawman present. "Could use someone with your skills wearing a badge." But Sarah had seen the life she wanted with Thomas, had dreamed of building something, of creating rather than destroying. Now those same skills would protect that dream. The Winchester found its home beside the north window, overlooking the approach from the mesa. The Colt carbine rested near the back door, and her father's revolver stayed on her hip. She'd positioned lanterns strategically, not for light, but as potential weapons. Oil could burn more than wicks. "Your grandfather," she told her unborn child as she worked, "once held off 8 rustlers for 2 days straight, did it by making them think he had a whole posse with him." Her hands moved methodically, checking primers and counting cartridges. Called it the art of tactical deception. "We're about to give that lesson a try." Sarah had spent the afternoon dragging Thomas's spare clothes around the property, positioning them to cast shadows through windows. A hat here, a jacket there, the illusion of multiple defenders. She'd moved the livestock to the far pasture, denying the escaped convicts both targets and cover. The root cellar became her fallback position, stocked with water, ammunition, and medical supplies. She'd learned that lesson from her father too. Always have a last resort, always plan for the worst while hoping for the best. As full darkness settled, Sarah felt the familiar calm of absolute focus descend. The baby shifted restlessly within her, sensing her tension perhaps, but she couldn't afford distraction now. Her father's voice guided her movements. "Make them work for every step, girl. Make them pay for every mistake." She positioned herself in the rocking chair, a blanket draped over her lap, concealing the shotgun beneath. The chair's familiar creak masked any other small sounds she might make. From here, she could cover 3 approaches to the house, while, appearing to doze, movement caught her eye, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper darkness near the barn. They were testing her defenses, probing for weaknesses. Sarah kept rocking, counting heartbeats between each creak of the chair's runners. 1001, 1002, a memory surfaced of her father, teaching her to shoot from unusual positions. "There'll be times," he'd said, "when you can't stand straight and aim proper, times when you have to adapt." She'd practiced until she could hit targets while lying down, while running, while climbing. Now, with her center of gravity shifted, by pregnancy, those lessons proved invaluable. The night deepened, and with it came the sounds, subtle at first, then growing bolder. Boot leather on packed earth, the soft clink of metal on metal, whispered commands carrying just a bit too far in the still air. They were surrounding the house, confident in their superior numbers. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Let them come. Let them think. The darkness was their ally. They didn't know about the tripwires she'd strung between the outbuildings, the careful arrangements of loose boards and empty tin cans that would betray their movement. They couldn't see the hidden markers she'd placed. A white stone here, a bent nail there, each one measured and memorized as a distance marker. The baby kicked again, strong and insistent. Sarah patted her belly gently. "I know, little one, I know, but your mama's got to teach these men a lesson about choosing their targets more carefully, about respecting women and homes and the quiet life we've built here. The first shot would come soon." She could feel it building in the air, like the charge before a lightning strike. Sarah settled deeper into the rocking chair, her finger resting lightly beside the trigger of the concealed shotgun. The calm deepened, spreading through her like still water. "Come on, then," she whispered into the darkness. "Let's see if prison taught you anything about patience." The first attack came just after midnight. A bottle sailed through the kitchen window, spilling kerosene across the floor. The spark from its crude wick died before it could catch, meeting only the wet boards Sarah had prepared. Her counterattack was immediate and precise. The Winchester cracked once, guided by the muzzle flash of their covering fire. A scream told her she'd found her mark. These men hadn't learned their lesson about showing themselves against the night sky. "That's one," she whispered, working the lever action smoothly as she changed position. The rocking chair continued its steady motion, now empty but still drawing sporadic fire from the desperate men. They were smarter this time, using the darkness for cover, but Sarah had spent a lifetime learning to read the night. A scuff of boot leather, a whispered curse, the subtle shift of shadow against shadow, each sound painted a picture clearer than daylight. Her pregnancy forced adaptations. She couldn't move as quickly or as low as she'd like, but she'd prepared. For that, rope pulls positioned strategically allowed her to shift from one firing position to another while staying protected. The baby kicked steadily, a reminder of what she was fighting for. A flash of movement by the water trough caught her eye. Sarah squeezed the trigger twice. The first shot went wide, but the second found flesh. Another man down, clutching his leg as he dragged himself to cover. Two, she counted softly, already moving to her next position. They tried to rush the back door then, thinking she was occupied with their wounded. The tripwire caught the first man at ankle height, sending him sprawling into the carefully arranged tin cans. Sarah's shotgun roared, the spread pattern catching his partner in the chest. Not fatal at that range, but enough to take the fight out of him. Three. The night dissolved into a deadly game of cat and mouse. Sarah moved like a ghost through her home, appearing at one window only to fire from another. The pregnant woman they'd thought to victimize had become a terrifying force, striking without warning and vanishing before they could respond. Every shot was measured, every movement calculated. Her father had taught her to make each round count, and tonight she was his star pupil once again. The darkness between shots stretched thick with tension, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the increasingly panicked whispers of the survivors. When dawn finally began to lighten the sky, 3 of the 5 men lay wounded but alive in the dust of her yard. The other 2 had fled into the night, leaving their companions behind. Sarah stood at her front door, the Winchester cradled in her arms, watching the sun rise over her defended home. The baby stirred within her, active. After the long night, "It's all right, little one," she soothed. "The worst is over. Now we just have to wait for the law to arrive." She'd fired 3 shots into the air when the attack began, the signal for help they'd arranged with their nearest neighbors. She could already hear horses approaching. Help was coming. But Sarah Matthews had proven she didn't need rescuing. She had protected her home, her child, and the life she'd built, just as her father had taught her. The marshal would later say he'd never seen anything like it. One pregnant woman holding off 5 desperate convicts through the night. But Sarah knew better. She wasn't just one woman. She was her father's daughter, her husband's wife, and her child's mother. She was every frontier woman who'd ever been underestimated, who'd ever had to prove that strength came in many forms. As the sun rose higher, Sarah kept her vigil, knowing the 2 who escaped wouldn't stay gone for long. But that was a fight for another day, and she would be ready. Marshal Jenkins arrived with the morning sun, leading a small posse of neighboring ranchers. He took one look at the 3 wounded men laid out in Sarah's yard and let out a low whistle. "Dead-eye, Sarah," he said, shaking his head in amazement. "Should have known it was you when I heard the story." The 2 escaped prisoners, who remained at large, had left a trail even a child could follow. Blood drops and desperate tracks leading toward the mesa. Sarah stood on her porch, one hand resting on her belly, while she gave Jenkins a full account of the night's events. "Dead-eye, Sarah?" one of the wounded men croaked from where he lay. "The shooting champion." The fear in his voice was palpable now, recognition dawning too late. "Boys said this would be an easy score, just some rancher's pregnant wife." "Your boys were wrong," Jenkins said, securing the prisoner's restraints. "This here's Sarah Matthews, formerly Sarah Crawford, 7-time territorial shooting champion. Her father wrote half the training manuals I give my deputies." Sarah watched the information sink in, saw the moment the wounded men realized just how badly they'd miscalculated. Their leader, still nursing his mangled hand from their first encounter, couldn't meet her eyes. "The other two," Sarah said, turning back to Jenkins, "they'll be back. Men like that, with wounded pride and nothing left to lose, always come back." The marshal nodded grimly. "We'll post a watch, get some men out tracking them. Maybe catch them before—" "No!" Sarah's voice was firm. "They're mine to deal with. They chose this fight, threatened my home, my child. I'll finish it." "Sarah," Jenkins started, concern evident in his voice, "you're 6 months along. You've done enough. Let us handle—" "Marshal," she cut him off. "With all due respect, I just spent the night proving I'm more than capable, with child or without. Those men are dangerous because they're desperate, and desperate men make mistakes. I'm counting on those mistakes." She turned to survey her property in the morning light. The bullet holes in the walls, the broken window, the blood staining her yard, all of it would need tending. But first, she had to end this. "Besides," she added, checking the Winchester's action with practiced hands, "they don't know these hills. Like I do. Don't know the hiding spots, the shooting positions my father and I mapped out years ago. Out here, carrying a child just means I've got even more reason to make every shot count." Jenkins knew that look. He'd seen it in her eyes during competitions, that unwavering focus that made her legendary among shooting circles. "At least let me leave a couple of men. They'll only get in my way." Sarah's tone softened. "I appreciate the offer, Marshal, but this needs to end clean. Just me and them. They came hunting what they thought was easy prey. Time they learned how badly they judged their quarry." The Marshal finally nodded, recognizing there would be no swaying her. As his men began loading the wounded prisoners into the wagon, he turned back. "Your father would be proud, Sarah. This is exactly why he trained you so hard." "He trained me," Sarah corrected, "so I'd never have to prove myself this way. So men would think twice before seeing a woman alone as an easy target." She patted her belly thoughtfully. "Seems some lessons need to be taught over and over." As the posse departed with their prisoners, Sarah began her preparations for the final confrontation. The remaining two would be back by nightfall, wounded animals seeking revenge, throwing caution to the wind. They'd try something bold, something desperate. She smiled grimly, checking her ammunition one more time. Bold and desperate was exactly what she was counting on. The baby kicked again, strong and steady, and Sarah took it as a sign of approval. "Just a little longer, little one," she whispered. "Mama's got 2 more lessons to teach about respecting frontier women. Then we can focus on more important things, like teaching you everything my father taught me." They waited until the heat of the afternoon to make their move, when the sun turned the air into shimmering waves above the parched earth. The first warning came as smoke, thick black plumes rising from the south end of Sarah's property. They'd set fire to her hay storage, hoping to draw her out or force her to abandon the house. "Predictable," Sarah muttered, staying positioned at her window. The hay was a loss, but she'd expected something like this. The warehouse was far enough from the house that the flames wouldn't spread, and the wind was blowing away from the main. Buildings. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Fire's a coward's weapon, girl. Shows they're running out of options." The smoke provided excellent cover for both sides. Sarah watched through the Winchester's scope as shadows moved through the black clouds. They were trying to use the distraction to approach from multiple angles, not realizing she'd already prepared for this scenario. A sharp pain in her lower back made her wince. The baby was restless, perhaps sensing her tension, and the long hours of vigilance were taking their toll. Sarah shifted position, finding a more comfortable stance while maintaining her sightlines. The first man broke cover, exactly where she'd predicted, trying to dash from the smoke to the cover of the water trough. Sarah's shot kicked up dirt at his feet, driving him back into the choking black clouds. She wasn't trying to hit him, not yet. She was herding him, forcing him toward the trap she'd laid. "Come on," she whispered. "Take the easy path, the obvious route." As if hearing her thoughts, a figure emerged from the smoke, running low toward the barn. The route looked clear, protected, except for the thin wire Sarah had strung at ankle height. The man went down hard, cursing as he rolled. Sarah's second shot convinced him to stay down. The last man, the one who'd been their leader before. She'd taken his trigger finger, was cleverer. He'd worked his way around during the confusion, using the smoke and his partner's distraction to approach from the blind side of the house. It was a good plan, exactly what Sarah's father would have called sound tactical thinking. It was also exactly what she'd been waiting for. The tripwire caught him by surprise, sending him sprawling into the row of tin cans she'd positioned. The noise was like a dinner bell ringing across the property. Sarah pivoted smoothly, bringing the Winchester to bear. But her shot went wide as another pain seized her lower back. The man scrambled for cover behind her rain barrel, firing wildly with his remaining hand. Sarah forced herself to breathe through the discomfort, remembering her father's lessons about shooting under stress. Pain is just another form of weather, girl. Account for it like you would account for wind. She waited for the right moment, timing her shots between contractions. The baby was definitely making its presence known, picking the worst possible time to add complications to an already complex situation. "Not now, little one," she muttered, adjusting her aim. "Mama's got business to finish first." The leader made a break for better cover, and Sarah's world narrowed to the sight picture, the trigger pressure, the space between heartbeats. The Winchester cracked, and the man went down screaming, clutching his remaining hand. The other prisoner tried to use the moment to rush her position, but Sarah had planned for this too. The shotgun she'd mounted on a pivot swung smoothly, requiring minimal movement on her part. One blast was all it took to convince him that surrender was his best option. As the smoke began to clear, Sarah kept her weapons trained on the wounded men. Another contraction gripped her stronger this time, and she allowed herself a grim smile. "Your timing needs work," she told her unborn child, "but your instincts are good." Waiting until Mama had finished the fight, the sound of approaching horses signaled the return of Marshal Jenkins and his men, drawn by the smoke. Sarah didn't lower her guard. She'd seen too many desperate last stands to take chances now. Her father had taught her that the end of a fight was often the most dangerous part. "You men," she called out to the defeated prisoners, "throw out your weapons and lay face down, unless you'd like to find out if pregnancy affects my aim at this range." The clatter of discarded guns was her answer. Sarah allowed herself to breathe a little easier, though she kept her finger near the trigger. The baby kicked again, as if applauding the victory. "That's right, little one," she whispered. "This is how a Matthews handles uninvited guests." With the prisoners secured and taken into custody, Sarah finally allowed herself to acknowledge the war being waged within her own body. The contractions were coming faster now, too early by months. Her hands trembled slightly as she lowered herself into her father's old rocking chair, the Winchester still within reach. "Not yet," she murmured, running her hands over her swollen belly. "You've got to hold on a little longer, little one." The baby's movements had become more insistent, as if responding to the day's violence and tension. Marshal Jenkins had left 2 deputies behind, despite her protests. They patrolled the perimeter of her property, but Sarah knew better than to rely entirely on others for her safety. Her father's voice whispered warnings in her memory. "Trust is good, girl, but self-reliance is better." The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Sarah focused on her breathing, trying to calm both herself and her unborn child. The old midwife in town had warned her about this, how stress and excitement could bring labor on early. She should have listened more carefully. Another contraction gripped her, and Sarah bit back a groan. She'd faced down armed men without flinching, but this was a different kind of battle. This enemy couldn't be shot, couldn't be driven off with well-placed bullets and stern warnings. "Your grandmother went through this too," she told her belly, remembering the stories her mother used to tell. "Right in the middle of an Apache raid, gave birth in a root cellar while arrows thudded into the door." The memory brought a smile to her face despite the pain. "Course, you're trying to come a bit early, eager to join the fight, are you?" Moving carefully, Sarah began to implement the techniques the midwife had taught her. Slow walks around the room, gentle rocking, steady breathing. Her gun belt felt heavy now, the weapons an awkward burden against her contracting muscles, but she refused to set them aside. Not yet. Not until she was certain the danger had truly passed. As night fell, the contractions began to ease, gradually spacing themselves further apart. The baby's movements became calmer, settling into a gentler rhythm. Sarah felt tears of relief spring. To her eyes, they had dodged this bullet, at least for now. Outside, she could hear the deputies making their rounds, their boots crunching on the hard-packed earth. The sound should have been reassuring, but Sarah found herself analyzing their patrol pattern, noting the gaps in their coverage. Old habits died hard. "Your grandfather would say we're being paranoid," she told her belly, checking the primers. "On her revolvers, out of pure instinct. But he's also the one who taught me that paranoia is just good planning in disguise." The night deepened, and Sarah allowed herself to drift in and out of a light doze, always keeping one hand near her weapon. Her dreams were filled with gunsmoke and her father's lessons, mixing with the pain that still occasionally gripped her body. "A fighter," she whispered, feeling the baby shift position. "Just like your mama, but let's agree to save the real fighting. For when you're ready to face the world properly." By midnight, the contractions had faded to irregular twinges. Sarah knew she'd been lucky this time, but the experience had taught her something important. She wasn't just protecting herself anymore, wasn't just defending her home. Every action, every decision had consequences for the tiny life she carried. Her father had taught her to shoot, to fight, to survive. But this was a different kind of strength he'd never prepared her for. The strength to know when to step back, when to accept help, when to put the safety of her child above her pride. "We'll find the balance," she promised herself, and her unborn child. Between being strong and being smart, between standing alone and accepting help. She patted her belly gently. "And when you're ready, really ready, I'll teach you everything. How to shoot straight, how to stand your ground, and how to know which battles are worth fighting." The baby kicked once, softly, as if in agreement. Sarah smiled and kept rocking, her weapons close at hand, waiting for dawn to break over her defended home. Dawn broke with gunfire. The deputies had grown complacent during their night watch, and the two remaining prisoners had friends. Mean, desperate men who'd been hiding in the hills, waiting for their chance. Sarah heard the first shot from her rocking chair, where she'd been dozing fitfully, one hand still on her Winchester. The sound of falling bodies and boots on her porch told her the deputies were down, hopefully just wounded. 5 distinct voices whispered outside, their words muffled but their intent clear. They thought they had her cornered, thought the night's false peace had made her soft. "Remember what you promised," Sarah whispered to her belly, feeling the baby shift restlessly. "No early arrivals today. Mama's got work to do." The first man through her door took a round in the shoulder, the Winchester's roar deafening in the confined space. Sarah was already moving, using the rope pulleys she'd rigged to help her shift positions, despite her pregnant bulk. The second man fired wildly at where she'd been, splintering her grandmother's rocking chair. "That," Sarah called out, her voice steady, "was a family heirloom." Her next shot caught him in the leg, sending him sprawling. She heard cursing, the shuffle of boots as the others tried to coordinate their attack. The leader's voice, she recognized it from before, called out from behind the wall. "Nowhere to run now, Deadeye. We know all about you, got the whole place surrounded. Why don't you make it easy on yourself and that baby?" Sarah's response was a careful shot through the wall, right where she knew the support beam was thinnest. The man's scream told her she'd judged the angle correctly. Her father's lessons on house construction were paying off in ways he'd probably never imagined. 4 rounds left, she counted silently, shifting position again. The baby kicked, making her grunt softly. "Not now, little one. Mama's counting." They rushed her then, thinking the sound of pain meant weakness. 2 men burst through different windows while another kicked in the back door. Sarah's world narrowed to angles and trajectories, to the space between heartbeats and the pressure of the trigger. The Winchester spoke twice more. 2 men fell, but the third got close enough that Sarah had to roll awkwardly, her pregnant belly making the movement clumsy. She lost her grip on the rifle as she moved, heard it clatter across the floor. The man grinned, raising his pistol. "Not so dangerous now, are you?" Sarah's hand found her father's Colt tucked in the small of her back. The move was smooth, practiced, the kind of draw she'd done thousands of times. The man's grin faltered as he stared down the barrel. "My father," Sarah said calmly, "always taught me to keep a backup piece." The Colt bucked in her hand, and the man joined his companions on her floor, clutching his gun arm and howling. Outside, she heard boots running, not toward the house, but away. The last man standing had apparently decided to cut his losses. Sarah kept her weapon trained on the wounded men, using her free hand to massage her belly where the baby was kicking furiously. "It's all right," she soothed, though whether she was talking to her child or herself wasn't entirely clear. Just a little excitement, nothing we couldn't handle. She heard more horses approaching, Marshal Jenkins returning with reinforcements drawn by the gunfire. But Sarah didn't lower her guard. Her father had taught her that survival meant staying sharp until the last possible danger had passed. "Jat!" Wounded men on her floor moaned and cursed, but none tried to move. They'd learned their lesson about underestimating pregnant women. Sarah kept the Colt steady, watching the light of dawn creep across her bullet-scarred floors. "Your grandfather would be proud," she told her belly, "though he might suggest we find a quieter place to raise you." The baby kicked again and Sarah smiled grimly. "Then again, maybe not. Seems you might have a taste for excitement yourself." The wind changed first, carrying with it the acrid smell of dust and danger. Sarah had lived in the territory long enough to recognize the signs. A dust storm was rolling in, and with it the last desperate push from her remaining adversary. The man who'd fled would use this cover, she knew. It was what she would have done. "Marshal," she called to Jenkins as his men secured the wounded, "get your people inside. Storm's coming, and it's bringing company." The sky turned the color of old copper as the wall of dust approached, transforming day into an eerie twilight. Sarah moved through her home with purpose, positioning herself for what was to come. The baby shifted uneasily within her as the air. Pressure dropped. "I know, little one," she murmured, checking her ammunition one last time. "I don't like it either." The storm hit like a locomotive, howling around the corners of the house and reducing visibility to arm's length. Windows rattled in their frames as sand and debris pelted the glass. Sarah kept her back to the wall, monitoring each entrance point, knowing her opponent would use the storm's fury as cover. She didn't have to wait long. The first sign was subtle, a shadow moving against shadows, barely visible through the dust-caked windows. Sarah tracked it with her father's Colt, waiting. The man was being careful this time, learning from his companion's mistakes, but he'd forgotten one crucial detail. "The thing about dust storms," Sarah's father had told her once, "is they leave traces. Every footprint, every disturbance shows clear as day in fresh fallen dust." The man's boot prints appeared on her porch, marking his approach to the side door. Sarah smiled grimly. He was following the exact path she'd hoped he would, leading himself right into her trap. The door burst open, letting in a swirl of dust and violence. The man had wrapped a bandana around his face against the storm, but his eyes widened as he realized his mistake. Sarah wasn't where any sane person would be, taking cover from the storm. Instead, she stood in plain view, using the dust-filled air to her advantage. His gun came up, but the dust had worked its way into the mechanism. The hammer fell on nothing but a click. Sarah's weapon, carefully oiled and protected, had no such problems. "Drop it," she commanded, her voice carrying. Despite the storm's howl, "Unless you want to join your friends in the marshal's wagon," the man's eyes darted between her steady gun hand and her swollen belly. "You're crazy!" He spat through his bandana. "Standing out in this? In your condition?" "What's crazy," Sarah replied calmly, "is thinking a dust storm would stop me from protecting my home." The baby kicked, as if in agreement, making her smile. "Now we can do this the easy way, or you can find out if I shoot as straight in a storm as I do in sunshine." He chose the hard way. They always did. His lunge was quick, desperate, the movement of a man who knew he had nothing left to lose. But Sarah had been ready for it, had planned for this moment ever since she'd seen the storm approaching. The colt barked once, the sound almost lost in the storm's fury. The man stumbled, clutching his shoulder, his face a mask of disbelief behind. "The bandana. How?" he gasped. "How did you—" "My father taught me to shoot by sound," Sarah explained, keeping her weapon trained on him as he sank to his knees. "By feel, by instinct. Said a true shooter needs to hit their mark even when they can't see it." She paused, letting him digest that. "The dust storm was your last mistake, thinking it would blind me when all it did was make you predictable." Through the howling wind, she heard Marshal Jenkins and his men approaching, drawn by the gunshot. The storm was beginning to ease, the worst of its fury spent. Sarah kept her aim steady until the marshal had the man in custody. Only then did she lower the colt, feeling the full weight of exhaustion settling into her bones. The baby moved restlessly, and she placed a soothing hand on her belly. "That's the last of them," she told her unborn child. "Now we can focus on more important things, like getting this place cleaned up before your papa comes home." The storm rolled on across the territory, leaving behind a layer of dust that coated everything like fresh snow. But beneath that dust, Sarah Matthews' home stood unbowed, its defender undefeated, awaiting the dawn of a new day. In the storm's aftermath, as dust settled on every surface like fresh fallen snow, Sarah Matthews faced her final test. The leader of the escaped prisoners, the one who'd first threatened her with such contempt, had slipped away during the chaos. But Sarah knew he hadn't gone far. Men like him, their pride wounded deeper than their flesh, always came back for one last try. She found his trail easily enough, blood drops in the dust, leading toward her barn. The marshal and his men were occupied with the other prisoners, leaving Sarah to face this final confrontation alone, just as it had begun. "Stay alert, little one," she whispered to her belly. "This is the last lesson about choosing your battles wisely." The barn door stood slightly ajar, stirring in the dying wind. Sarah approached with the caution her father had drilled into her since childhood, Winchester ready, eyes scanning for any sign of movement. The baby kicked steadily, like a second heartbeat urging her forward. "I know you're in there," she called out, positioning herself to the side of the door. "Your men are caught. The storm's past. There's nowhere left to—" "Run!" A harsh laugh echoed from the darkness within. "Who's running? I've been waiting for this." "Just you and me now, Deadeye Sarah. No deputies, no tricks, no dust storm to hide behind. Then come out and face me properly. Or are you afraid of a pregnant woman?" His response was a gunshot that splintered the wood where her head would have been if she'd stood in front of the door. Sarah smiled grimly. Some men never learned. "My father," she said conversationally, shifting her position, "used to say that a man who shoots blind is a man who's already lost. He's just too proud to know it yet." Another shot rang out, wild and desperate. Sarah counted the rounds silently, remembering the type of pistol he carried. 2 shots left, maybe 3. "Your father ain't here," the man snarled. "Just you and that baby you're carrying. How steady can you really be in your condition? How quick can you move?" Sarah's response was to put a round through the barn wall, exactly where she knew the support beam stood. The resulting curse told her she'd judged his position correctly. "Steady enough," she said calmly, "and I don't need to be quick. You're the one running out of options." She heard him moving inside, trying to circle around. But Sarah knew every board, every shadow of her barn. She'd measured the distances, memorized the angles, just as her father had taught her. "Last chance," she called out. "Surrender now. Walk out alive. Keep pushing. and I'll do what needs doing. His answer was predictable. Another shot, another miss. 1 round left, by her count. You know what your mistake was? Sarah asked, moving to her chosen position. Not the threats, not the violence, not even underestimating me. She paused, letting the silence build. Your mistake was threatening. My child, that's something no mother can forgive. He charged then, bursting through the barn door with his gun blazing, spending his last round in a desperate bid to end her. But Sarah had been ready, had been counting on exactly this reaction. The Winchester spoke once, precise and final. The man's gun clattered to the ground, followed by his body. He clutched his shoulder, staring up at her with a mixture of pain and disbelief. You didn't kill me, he gasped. Sarah kept her rifle trained on him, her voice steady. No, death's too easy a teacher. I want you to live with this lesson. Want you to remember how a pregnant woman beat you. Want you to tell everyone in Yuma Territorial about why it's a bad idea to underestimate a mother protecting her child. Marshall's men took him away moments later, but Sarah remained in the barn's doorway, watching the sun break through the last remnants of the dust storm. The baby moved within her, calmer now that the danger had passed. That's the last of the shooting for a while, she promised her unborn child. Time to focus on bringing you into a peaceful world. Well, as peaceful as we can make it. As she turned back toward her bullet-scarred home, Sarah felt a profound shift in herself. She was no longer just her father's daughter, the legendary Deadeye Sarah. She was something more now, a defender not just of land and home, but of the future itself. The next few days passed in a blur of activity as the territory buzzed with news of Sarah Matthews' stand. Women from neighboring homesteads brought food and helped clean up the bullet-scarred house, while their husbands assisted in repairing windows and patching walls. Each visitor carried away a piece of the story, spreading it across the territory like seeds in the wind. Sarah received them all from her rocking chair, one hand resting on her belly, the other never far from her father's Colt. Old habits died hard, and the echo of gunfire still rang in her ears. The baby seemed calmer now, as if sensing that the danger had truly passed. 7 men, she overheard one of the ranch hands whisper. 7 armed men against 1 pregnant woman, and she dropped every last one of them without taking a scratch. Deadeye Sarah, another replied with a note of awe. My pa used to talk about seeing her shoot in competitions. Said she could hit a playing card at 300 yards. The marshal made daily visits, checking on her and bringing news of the prisoners. They'd all survived their wounds. Sarah's aim had been precise, designed to stop rather than kill. That fact seemed to impress people even more than the shooting itself. You could have killed them all, Jenkins said one evening, accepting a cup of coffee. Would have been within your rights, given the circumstances. Sarah adjusted herself, in the rocking chair, feeling the baby shift. Killing's easy, Marshal. My father taught me that. It's showing mercy while still teaching a lesson. That's the harder shot. Word came that Thomas was on his way home. The cattle drive cut short when news of the attack reached him. Sarah found herself watching the horizon, torn between longing for her husband's return and a strange new confidence in her ability to handle whatever came her way. The midwife visited too, clucking her tongue over Sarah's condition, but admitting that both mother and child seemed remarkably well despite the ordeal. Strong stock, the old woman declared, like mother, like child. In quiet moments, Sarah would sit on her porch, watching the sun paint the desert in golds and purples. Her hands would move automatically to clean her weapons, the ritual as natural as breathing. But now she found herself thinking more about the future than the past. Your grandfather taught me to shoot to protect myself, she told her unborn child. But I protected you without having to kill anyone. That's the real lesson here. Strength isn't just about being the deadliest shot. Sometimes it's about knowing when not to shoot. The community changed too. Where once they'd seen her as Thomas Matthews's pretty wife, they now saw her as something more. Women began asking her about learning to shoot, about protecting themselves. Men tipped their hats with new respect when they passed. Things will be different for you, she promised her belly. You'll grow up in a world where being a woman doesn't mean being defenseless, where being pregnant doesn't mean being weak. 1 week after the final confrontation, Thomas rode up to their homestead. He took in the patched bullet holes, the new windows, the gathered neighbors, and his wife in the rocking chair, still armed. Despite her condition, their eyes met across the yard, and Sarah saw in his gaze not the worry or disappointment she'd feared, but pride and love so fierce it brought tears to her eyes. "Heard you've been busy," he said simply, crossing the porch. To kneel beside her chair, Sarah took his hand and placed it on her belly, where their child kicked strongly against his palm. "Just keeping our home safe," she replied. "Figured our little one deserved a peaceful arrival." Thomas laughed, the sound carrying across the homestead. "Peaceful, with you for a mother. This child's going to grow up knowing exactly how strong a woman can be." And in that moment, surrounded by the community that had rallied to help rebuild, her husband's hand warm against her belly, Sarah Matthews felt the last tensions of the past days fade away. She had protected her home, her child, and in doing so, had helped change the territory's view of what a woman, even a pregnant one, could do. The Winchester still hung above the door, and her father's Colt still rode on her hip, but they felt different now. Not just weapons, but symbols of a legacy she would pass on. A legacy of strength tempered with mercy, of standing one's ground while knowing when to bend. As autumn painted the territory in shades of gold and crimson, life on the Matthews homestead found a new rhythm. The bullet holes were patched, the windows replaced, but subtle changes remained, like the way Thomas never questioned the loaded Winchester by their bed, or how the neighboring women now gathered weekly for shooting practice under Sarah's watchful eye. "Square your shoulders," Sarah called out to Mrs. Peterson, adjusting her stance despite her now prominent belly. "Remember, the gun's just an extension of your eye, and your eye's just an extension of your will." Her father's words flowed naturally from her lips, taking on new meaning as she passed them to the next generation of frontier women. Thomas watched these sessions from the porch, pride evident in his eyes. He'd returned from the cattle drive to find his wife transformed, not just in the eyes of the community, but in her own bearing. The quiet confidence she'd always possessed now shone like a beacon, drawing others to its light. "Never thought I'd see the day," old Jim Harper commented during a supply run to town. "Women folk learning to shoot like men." He spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Times are changing." "Times already changed," Thomas replied, thinking of his wife facing down desperados while carrying their child. "Some folks are just catching up to it." The story of Deadeye Sarah and the prison gang spread across the territory, growing with each telling. Some said she'd faced down 20 men. Others claimed she'd shot the guns right out of their hands at 1,000 yards. Sarah let them talk, knowing that sometimes a legend could teach lessons that truth couldn't match. But the real changes were quieter, more profound, like the way young girls now stood straighter when Sarah passed, looking at her with dreams in their eyes, or how the territory's men had started treating their wives' concerns about safety with new respect. "Your timing was perfect, little one," Sarah told her belly one evening, feeling the baby's strong movements. "You helped me prove that being pregnant doesn't mean being helpless, that protecting life doesn't always mean taking it." The failed assault had sparked something in the territory, a recognition that strength came in many forms, and that underestimating someone based on their condition or gender could be a fatal mistake. Marshal Jenkins reported that crime against homesteads had dropped significantly, especially those where women were known to shoot. Sarah's father sent a letter, his pride evident in every word. "Always knew you'd surpass my teaching," he wrote. "But you've done more than that, girl. You've changed how the whole territory thinks about women and weapons, about strength and mercy." The baby grew stronger as winter approached, kicking and shifting like it was practicing for its own shooting competitions. Sarah found herself modifying her father's lessons. adapting them for a changing world. It wasn't just about being the fastest shot or the deadliest aim anymore. It was about knowing when to show force and when to show mercy. The true measure of strength, she told her students, isn't in how many opponents you drop. It's in how many you don't have to face, because they respect you enough to keep their distance. The homestead flourished under their combined care. Thomas worked the land, while Sarah maintained their safety, each supporting the other's strengths. They added a room to the house, preparing for the child's arrival, and Sarah insisted on gun racks in every room, accessible but secure. "Our child," she declared, "will grow up knowing that safety comes from preparation, not fear, from respect, not terror." As autumn deepened toward winter, Sarah watched her growing band of students, mothers, daughters, wives, and saw the future taking shape. A future where women weren't just protected, but were protectors in their own right. Where pregnancy wasn't seen as a weakness to be exploited, but as one more reason to stand strong. The legend of Deadeye Sarah might fade with time, but her legacy would live on in every woman who learned to stand her ground, in every home made safer by knowledge rather than fear, and in the child growing beneath her heart, already learning lessons about strength, mercy, and the wisdom to know the difference. 3 months after the siege, Sarah Matthews stood before a group of 20 women at the newly established shooting range behind her homestead. Her belly, now in its final month, cast a prominent shadow in the morning light, but it didn't stop her from demonstrating proper stance and grip to her eager students. "A weapon," she explained, adjusting Mrs. Turner's hold on a Winchester, "is like any other tool. It's not good or evil on its own. What matters is the mind and heart behind it." She moved down the line, checking positions and offering corrections. And sometimes the strongest choice is knowing when to keep it holstered. The territory had changed in ways few could have predicted. The tale of her stand against the prison gang had sparked something in the women of the region, a recognition that they didn't have to accept vulnerability as their lot. Every week, more arrived at her homestead, seeking not just shooting lessons, but a new way of thinking about their place in the frontier. Marshal Jenkins made it official by appointing Sarah as a special deputy firearms instructor, the first woman to hold such a position in the territory. "Might as well get paid for what you're already doing," he'd said with a grin, handing her the badge. "Besides, having trained shooters in every homestead makes my job a lot easier." The imprisoned gang members, now recovered from their wounds, had become unwitting advocates for women's shooting skills. Their tale of being outshot by a pregnant woman spread through Yuma Territorial Prison, making others think twice about targeting remote homesteads. "I heard Deadeye Sarah can shoot the whiskers off a cat at 600 yards, became a common warning among the criminal element. And now she's training others to do the same. Sarah let the legends grow, understanding their value. Every exaggerated story meant one less attack, one less family threatened, one less need for actual violence. Her father had taught her to shoot, but life had taught her that prevention was better than cure. The women who trained with her learned more than just marksmanship. They learned confidence, self-reliance, and the wisdom to know when not to shoot. Young girls started coming with their mothers, learning early that being female didn't mean being defenseless. "My Elizabeth used to hide behind my skirts when strangers came calling," Mrs. Peterson told Sarah one afternoon. "Now she stands tall, checks their intentions. Just knowing she can protect herself has changed everything about her." Thomas supported it all, building proper shooting stalls and helping to organize training schedules. He understood that his wife's legacy would extend far beyond their own homestead. The child she carried would be born into a different world than the one they'd known, one where women's strength was acknowledged and respected. The ultimate validation came in the form of a letter from the territorial governor requesting Sarah's advice on establishing similar training programs throughout Arizona. "Your methods," he wrote, "have proven that an armed society need not be a violent one when proper training and wisdom are applied." Sarah read the letter aloud to her students, her free hand resting on her belly where her child moved restlessly. "This is what we're building," she told them, "not just skills with a weapon, but a new understanding of strength, one that recognizes that true power lies not in the ability to take life, but in the wisdom to protect it." The women nodded, their eyes bright with purpose. Many had started as timid, uncertain students, jumping at the sound of gunfire. Now they stood straight and confident, their weapons handled with the respect and skill Sarah had instilled in them. Deadeye Sarah, once a nickname from shooting competitions, had become something larger, a symbol of change in the territory. But Sarah found more pride in watching her students master themselves than she ever had in her own achievements. "Your grandfather's legacy," she told her unborn child during quiet moments, "was teaching me to shoot. But yours will be growing up in a world where strength isn't determined by gender, where being a woman or a mother means being capable of anything." And as autumn faded toward winter, Sarah Matthews continued to build that legacy, one lesson at a time, while the child within her grew stronger, preparing to enter a world its mother had helped to change. The baby came during the first snowfall of winter, as if waiting for the perfect moment to make its entrance. Sarah's water broke while she was teaching her morning class, and her students transformed instantly from pupils to supporters, their recently acquired confidence showing in their calm efficiency. Mrs. Peterson rode for the midwife, while Mrs. Turner helped Sarah inside. The other women secured the homestead with the thoroughness Sarah had taught them, proving they'd learned far more than just shooting during their lessons. "Your timing," Sarah told her belly between contractions, "is as perfect as your aim." The baby's response was another strong kick, as if eager to join the world. Thomas arrived from the fields to find their home surrounded by armed women standing guard, taking their self-appointed duty as seriously as any military unit. He couldn't help but smile at how much things had changed, how much his wife had changed them. The birth itself was long but uncomplicated. Sarah faced it with the same steady determination she'd shown during the siege, drawing on deep reserves of strength. The midwife later said she'd never seen someone so focused, so in control, even during the most intense moments. Just like shooting. Sarah had gasped between pushes. "Find your center, control your breathing, trust your body to know what to do." As dawn broke over the snow-covered territory, a new voice joined the world, strong and clear and unafraid. The midwife placed the squalling infant on Sarah's chest, and all the strength that had defended their home, all the skill that had protected their future, melted into pure love. "It's a girl," Thomas announced, his voice thick with emotion. "As beautiful and strong as her mama." Sarah looked down at her daughter, counting fingers and toes, noting the surprising strength of her grip. "Hello, Grace," she whispered, the name they'd chosen feeling perfect for this child born of both power and mercy. "Welcome to the world we've been preparing for you." News of Grace Matthews' birth spread across the territory almost as quickly as the tales of her mother's stand had traveled. Women from Sarah's shooting classes brought gifts, not just the traditional blankets and clothes, but also a custom-made rifle that would be waiting for Grace when she was old enough to learn. Marshal Jenkins arrived with his wife, bringing a tiny silver deputy's badge made special for the newest member of their community. "Figure she ought to have it," he said gruffly, "being royalty around here and all." Sarah's father made the long journey from his ranch, his weather-worn face softening at the sight of his granddaughter. He spent hours just holding her, telling her stories of her mother's first shooting lessons, of the legacy she carried in. "Her blood. You've done something remarkable here," he told Sarah, "not just in standing your ground, but in teaching others to stand theirs. This little one won't have to fight the same battles you did." As Grace grew stronger in those first weeks, Sarah noticed how alert she was, how her eyes tracked movement just like a natural shooter's would. But more importantly, she saw how the women who visited held themselves differently now, confident, capable, unafraid. "Your arrival changed everything," she told Grace during midnight feedings. "From the moment you started growing inside me, you were helping to build a better world. Those men thought my pregnancy made me vulnerable, but protecting you made me stronger than I'd ever been." The Winchester still hung above the door, and Sarah's father's Colt still had its place of honor, but they were no longer just weapons. They had become symbols of a transformation, tools that had helped forge a new understanding of strength and capability in the territory. Grace Matthews would grow up knowing that her birth had been preceded by legends, but the true gift wasn't in the tales of her mother's shooting prowess. It was in the legacy of women standing tall, of strength tempered by wisdom, of a community transformed by the understanding that true power lay not in violence, but in the ability to prevent it. "That's your real inheritance," Sarah whispered to her sleeping daughter. "Not just how to shoot straight, but how to stand your ground, how to protect what matters, and how to change the world without firing a shot." 5 years passed like a dream. On a bright spring morning, Sarah Matthews stood at her familiar shooting range, watching her daughter Grace balance a tiny training rifle in her small hands. The girl's stance was natural, inherited from generations of shooters, but there was something different in her eyes, not just determination, but understanding. "Remember what we talked about," Sarah said softly. "Why do we learn to shoot?" "Not to hurt," Grace replied, her voice clear and confident, "but to protect, to make sure the bad things stay away." She adjusted her grip, just like her mother had, taught her, displaying the same intuitive grace that had earned Sarah her nickname. The territory had changed beyond recognition. Every homestead now had at least one trained shooter among its women. Crime had dropped so significantly that Marshall Jenkins joked about being out of a job. The story of Deadeye Sarah had evolved from a tale of violence to one of transformation, teaching that true strength lay in prevention rather than confrontation. Sarah watched her daughter squeeze the trigger, hitting the target dead center. But more important than her aim was the way Grace immediately made her weapon safe, just as she'd been taught. Understanding responsibility came before learning to shoot. "That's enough for today," Sarah said, gathering their equipment. From across the homestead, she could see her students arriving for their advanced class, women who now trained others in their own communities, spreading the knowledge like ripples in a pond. Grace helped pack up the targets, moving with the confidence of a child who had never known fear of being defenseless. This was Sarah's true legacy, not the legend of a pregnant woman defending her home, but the reality of a generation growing up knowing their own strength. "Tell me the story again, Mama," Grace asked as they walked back to the house. "About how I helped you protect our home before I was even born." Sarah smiled, lifting her daughter into her arms. "That story belongs to both of us, little one. And to every woman who learned that being strong doesn't always mean being hard. Sometimes the greatest strength is in knowing when not to shoot, in being wise enough to prevent trouble before it starts." As they reached their porch, Sarah saw Thomas teaching their younger son to mend fences. Their home now stood as a beacon in the territory, not just as a shooting school, but as proof that change was possible, that traditions could be honored. While forging new paths, the old Winchester still hung above their door, and Sarah's father's Colt still rode comfortably on her hip. But they were different now, symbols of a revolution that had come not with violence, but with wisdom, with the understanding that true security came not from fear, but from respect. Grace Matthews would grow up to be many things: a rancher, a teacher, a protector of her community. But more importantly, she would grow up knowing that her birth had helped change the territory, had shown that strength could wear many faces, and that sometimes the most powerful shot was the one you never had to fire. And that was a legacy worth protecting.